Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Steele, your instructor for SPPH 538, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about the second reading for week 1 of this semester. And that's an article by Ross Upshur titled Principles for the Justification of Public Health Intervention. And as we'll see, this article presents a framework for public health ethics that relies heavily on something known as the harm principle, which we'll learn more about. So for this lecture, I'm just going to jump straight into Upshur's framework because many of the aspects of Upshur's article that precede the framework are very similar to the discussion in the Childress and colleagues paper from the previous lecture. So for example, Upshur spent some time talking about the differences between public health and medicine and explaining that because of those differences, public health ethics is different than medical ethics and so on. And so I discussed that in the Childress and colleagues lecture, so I'm not going to repeat all that here. So jumping in, Upshur's framework is based on 4 principles, and these are the harm principle, which says that the government should only restrict individual freedom to prevent harm to others. The principle of least restrictive or least coercive means, which says that if you've got a less coercive or restrictive way of achieving a public health goal, then you should choose that rather than one that's more restrictive or coercive. And the reciprocity principle, which says that the government should assist individuals in fulfilling their public health responsibilities. And finally, the transparency principle, which says that all legitimate stakeholders should be involved in the decision-making process, have equal input, and that the decision-making should be clear and accountable. Now, I'm going to talk about each of these 4 principles in turn, and then consider and then discuss how the Upshur framework compares to the Childress and colleagues framework. Okay, so starting with the harm principle. To understand the harm principle, it's important to understand something called paternalism. Paternalism is something that actually came up in the Childress and colleagues reading, so there's a bit of overlap there. And it's also something we'll be looking at later in the term in more detail and depth. But very simply, paternalism means restricting a person's freedom for their own good. So an example would be me setting time limits on my kids' screen time. Obviously, that restricts their freedom. If left to their own devices, I think they might just spend every single waking hour, on the screens playing video games. Obviously, that would not be good for them. They wouldn't go to school. They wouldn't do homework. They wouldn't learn anything. They wouldn't get any exercise. They would ruin their eyesight. Not good. So for their own good, we restrict the time that they're allowed to spend playing video games on their iPads and laptops and stuff. So that's an example of paternalism. And of course, as this example illustrates, paternalism is something that literal parents have to do quite a lot. But the harm principle is about paternalism not by parents, but paternalism on the part of the government towards citizens who are adults. And the idea is that the government should not be interfering in, the lives of adult citizens in a similar manner in which parents can be justified in interfering with the freedom of their own children. And the idea is that of the harm principle is that if the government's going to interfere with someone's freedom, it's going to restrict their freedom in some way, the reason can't be for that person's own good. The reason has to be because of harm to other people. It can only, according to the harm principle, the government can only intervene to limit freedom of an individual if harm to some third party is at stake. So an example of a public health intervention that could be consistent with the harm principle would be something like bans on smoking in public indoor spaces. Obviously, smoking risks harm to others through secondhand smoke, which of course can cause cancer and all the other problems that directly smoking oneself can cause. And so that's a justification for not allowing people to smoke in indoor public spaces. So that might seem relatively straightforward. The harm principle might seem pretty clear that, okay, either there's a harm to third parties or there isn't. And so that's going to pretty clearly distinguish the kinds of cases where the government can intervene in people's lives. But as we'll see throughout the term, the reality is often a bit more complex. And here are two questions to think about that relate to that point. So first of all, you need to think about what counts as a harm to others. So for example, if costs to the healthcare system count as harms to others, then it would seem that just about anything a person could do that's not optimal for their own health could actually be counted as a harm to others, and therefore something that the government could justifiably sort of interfere with. So what that suggests is that if the harm principle is going to rule anything out, if it's going to eliminate any things that the government might possibly do, then what counts as a harm to others has to be restricted, and cost to the healthcare system maybe shouldn't count as harms to others. A second question is, how strong does the evidence of harm need to be? This is something that actually comes up in one of the examples that Upshur gives. His second example involves a factory that's leaching some toxic chemicals into a river or something, and then there's some epidemiological studies about whether those leaking chemicals are causing health harms to anybody, and the epidemiological studies are sort of inconclusive and don't find any clear evidence of harm. And in that example, Upshur suggests that, well, maybe on the basis of the harm principle, you couldn't justify any interference with this factory, like to force the factory owner to stop the leaking chemicals. And that raises this question of, well, how strong does the evidence of harm need to be before the government is justified in intervening? The second principle in Upshur's framework is the least restrictive means principle. And this principle states that if there is a harm to others and it is justifiable for the government to intervene, still the government should restrict freedom to the least amount possible. The example we discussed in the first lecture about implied versus informed consent in HIV screening is an example of this idea. So in that example, informed consent meant informing the pregnant person, we're going to do this test for HIV, and do you consent or not? And the person can say yes or no to that after being informed about the test and its uses and so on. Implied consent instead says that, well, someone comes to seek treatment, seeks prenatal care, then there's a sort of implied consent that they're going along with the routine things that are involved in that care, and we don't have to ask their informed consent to every single component. So if you take a blood sample and then you run a whole bunch of tests, you don't have to, for each thing you're testing for, and saying we're going to check for this, we're going to check for that, you don't have to get informed consent for all those things. That's the idea of implied consent. Now, the reason that this is an ethical issue is that obviously it's better to have more people get screened for HIV than less people, and especially in this context of perinatal screening. And yet, obviously, informed consent is something that is less restrictive to the freedom of the individual than implied consent. And so from the point of view of least restrictive means, you would prefer to do informed consent rather than implied consent. And from the point of view of that principle, the only reason to do the implied consent option, the only reason to have that as a policy would be if you just didn't get a high enough rate of prenatal screening. So suppose you got a really low rate of screening with informed consent, but a much higher rate with implied consent, then that potentially could be an argument under the restrictive means criterion why you would do the implied consent instead. So note to apply this rule, the least restrictive means, you need some kind of criteria for what counts as the public health objective. Say, perhaps you're aiming for 90% HIV prenatal screening rate in this example, but you need to have some relatively clear criterion for what it means to achieve that public health objective. And then the question is, well, do we really need to go to this more restrictive means to achieve that? An interesting thing to think about as well is that Upshur's discussion of the least restrictive means principle states that the means that you use to restrict people cannot be discriminatory. You cannot selectively apply them, differently to different, say, racialized groups, for instance, or differently according to people, according to their sexual orientation or other features of their identity. And that's an interesting thing to think about, and to think about whether there actually are examples in public health where you might have a restriction that is applied in a discriminatory manner. Actually, we'll talk about an example in class that potentially could have this kind of feature. All right, so let's move on then to reciprocity, which is the third of the four principles in Upshur's framework. So reciprocity states that government should assist people in fulfilling their public health obligations. An example that's given in the reading by Upshur is providing housing to a tuberculosis patient. In that example, the patient is unhoused and hasn't always been taking their medication the way that they are prescribed, and they've also been sometimes staying in a shelter, which of course is very crowded and obviously creates risks of transmission of the tuberculosis to other people. So in this case, Upshur suggests that if the person is required to isolate from other people, then for example, there should be help with housing, like putting this person up in a hotel room so that they can effectively isolate from other people. Now, one interesting thing is that Upshur only discusses reciprocity in connection with interventions that restrict freedom, like in this example about the person is required to isolate. But you can also think about reciprocity in relation to recommendations about things like diet and exercise, where the recommendation, the information that say, about how much exercise you should get each day don't really restrict anyone's freedom. So they're not restrictions of freedom in any sense. But at the same time, they require things to be able to do, right? So access to urban green spaces, for example, would make the recommendation easier to follow, and you could think of providing that access could be part of reciprocity. Transparency is the final principle in Upshur's framework, and in that, according to that principle, the decision making that goes behind this policy or this intervention should involve the legitimate stakeholders, and they should be fairly involved in this process. So this is really a shared decision making criterion. And it's useful to note here that this is different than the public justification criterion from Childress and colleagues' framework. Those two principles might look really similar, but in the Childress framework, public justification is really focused on communicating the reasons for the new policy. What is the policy? What are the reasons for it? What's the data behind it? Not on shared decision making, but rather on communication. And so one thing we can think about, and this is certainly something that will come up at various points in the term, are there challenges to transparency? Are there reasons why it might be difficult to engage with stakeholders? And what might be an example of that? Those are things we can discuss in class, or probably which will come up later in the term. All right. So to wrap up, it's helpful just to sort of put Childress and Upshur side by side and think about how they're different and how they're similar. Let's start with the similarities. So the most straightforward similarity is that the least infringement over here on Childress's side and the least restrictive or coercive means criterion are very similar. They're both saying, look, if there's a way to do what you want to do, a way to do this policy, this intervention that is less restrictive of people's freedoms, but achieves the result that you're aiming for, then do that instead. Do the policy in a way that's less restrictive. So that's similar. And these last two are similar. The public justification and transparency are similar, but as we noted, there's a subtle difference there that transparency is focused on shared decision-making, where public justification is really focused more on communication. Besides that, there are some pretty significant differences, though. So if you look at the Childress framework, one of the key ideas is you start by asking, is the policy effective? Does it benefit population health? If the answer is no, then that's it. You stop there. That's sort of like the gatekeeper. If the answer is yes, then you go on to consider, okay, sure, it will benefit population health, but is there any other ethical downside that outweighs that? And that's proportionality. If we go over here to Upshur, we can see that the first question you ask is about the harm principle. If this intervention is restricting someone's freedom, is it the case that their behavior is harmful to some third party? And if the answer to that is no, it really only is harmful to themselves, then Upshur's framework says, well, maybe this isn't really a public health thing to do. This isn't something that public health should be involved with. And so you can see there's a very different sort of starting question that you begin with. Also notice the reciprocity is present in Upshur's and not in the Childress framework. And the overall takeaway you can get from this is Upshur is really emphasizing individual freedom and making sure that public health doesn't unjustifiably restrict freedom. Childress and colleagues identify that as an important concern, but it's less central to them. Well, and that's my timer. Okay, thank you. And there's a question that we'll discuss in class. Bye-bye.